Hey guys, glad you got to be here with us tonight. I am so excited to be able to share with you a little bit about a passion I have and hopefully get this done in a way that makes it really well. So put my apron on here first. I'm going to be bouncing back and forth through shots so you guys can see some stuff. As you see, I have a plethora of coffee paraphernalia up here. Somebody asks why I love it and where my love for coffee came from. And really, ultimately, about probably 15 years ago, I went to a mission trip to Seattle, got to taste coffee for the first time the way it should be, and ever since then, it's been blowing up. It's amazing to me how bad coffee can be when it's not done right. If you take Folgers, some people are like, man, I love Folgers, but they settle for what's going on. Not to knock your Folgers or your McCafe or anything, but there's ways that you can do it and say, if you do it right, it brings out so much better flavor. The same thing is true to be said with church. We know for sure that we have had times when the church conflict happens or where church is a little bit upsetting, but with the church the way it should be, we look at the church in Acts and say, this is the way that the church should be. The early church, they did it right. They knew what they were doing. So what do we know? We want to know that it was focused on Jesus, led by the Spirit, connected with others. We sat there and had a compassion for people who were lost and sought after God. But the reality was, if the church was going to be perfect, it had to be a time where they would sit there and say, you know, we're going to have some conflict. Conflicts will arise in all that we do. So we sit there and say, how do you do that? Much like coffee. So what you got to do with coffee, and I have a whole lot of stuff here. I have my Brava Encore grinder. I have my Follow Stag. I have my Follow EKG. I have my Acacia scale. And I have an AeroPress. So I'm going to teach you guys how to make a decent cup of coffee using an AeroPress here. First thing you got to do is you got to take some water. Water needs to be filtered. But as we sit there and start relaying this back, and it's about close to 600 grams of water in this cup. Take it, we'll set it to the side. Turn on your EKG. And then you want it to be about 202 degrees. You guys can see that right there. See if we can do that. Right there. Perfect. And what's cool is that church, the way it should be, you have to sit there and say, what is going to happen? When dealing with people, no matter what the case is, the reality is there's always going to be conflict. It's going to happen. And what I've found is conflict's inevitable, but most relationships don't survive conflict. You get on to somebody, you disagree with them, you're like, it's just easier for us to go our separate ways. We start looking and seeing what that looks like there. Most relationships that do survive conflict are stronger. You start understanding what the other person thinks, what they believe, what they say, and we sit there and say, man, I can make it through this thing, and you know what? It strengthens my relationship. The other thing that we look at is unresolved conflict. It affects your spiritual life and it affects church. There's a passage in Acts chapter 15, if you will, and starting with verse 36, it said this: after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let us return and visit the brothers in every city where they proclaim the word of the Lord, and now they are seen. Now Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, but Paul wanted best not to take him with them, who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia. So you got to understand, Mark had this thing. His name was John, called Mark, but he left them earlier. And he didn't want to. And there arose a sharp disagreement between Paul and Barnabas. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed to Cyprus. Paul chose Silas and departed, and by having accommodated them by the brothers of the grace of the Lord, and he went to Syria and Sicily and strengthened the churches. So here's what happened. Let me explain this. My water's heating up a little bit. We have this conflict, if you will. There's a guy by the name of John Mark who wanted to go with these guys, but said, it's not necessarily the best idea. And the reason why, because he went earlier and he totally bailed out of everything. Paul says, I don't want him, I want somebody else. And Silas says, I want this other guy. And I like the words. It says there was a strict conflict that happened, a strict thing that they got into this fight. But what happened was they decided, hey, you know what? We're not going to agree on this. We're just going to go our own separate ways. And honestly, sometimes the best things that we can do is totally say, hey, we're not going to agree, so we're going to go our own way and do whatever God has called us to do. So that's what they did. And the very last verse of that chapter, verse 15 says this: they went to Syria and Sicily and strengthening the churches. Just because they didn't agree doesn't mean that they couldn't do the job that God called them to do. When we have church conflict, we start seeing what happens, and we see, okay, maybe there's a way for me to get through this with somebody else and say, how do I do that in a way that's positive? There's a guy by the name of Solomon, and he would write this, and Paul would replay it, and he would sit there, do not repay evil with evil. It's amazing to me how many times that we sit there and we start thinking that I can repay somebody because they got me back. It's not good. Not good at all. Today I'm also using Messenger coffee. This is a Bombay. It's an Ethiopian. It's got natural notes of it. And so what we're wanting to do here is we're wanting to take our coffee, and we will take it, and then we want to get about 15 grams of coffee. You get those 15 grams of coffee. Take a picture of it. Get my finger out of the way. You can see that. Perfect. 15 grams of coffee. And we want to put that in our Encore. Our Encore grinder is a burr grinder, and it's set to make a very fine cup of coffee here. So what we'll do is we'll set that about a 12, and then we make it to where it's pretty good. Let it grind. Now that that's ground up, that's the loud part, so we get back to this idea of how do I resolve conflict? You know that there's conflict that you're having with somebody, and maybe it's even somebody in your church. Maybe you felt a little bit left out. Maybe you felt upset. Maybe there's something going on. Let me be honest with you, though. A lot of conflict happens, and sometimes you don't even realize what's going on. The other person has no clue that they were even made you upset or had something going on. So how do you do this? How do you sit there and say, I want to resolve this conflict? First thing you got to have humility. You understand the condition of your own heart. We start looking at these things. For the outflow of the mouth comes the inflow of the heart in Matthew. It's much easier for me if I have conflict with somebody to sit there and say, hey, I might have done you wrong. I might not have done everything right. And come in and say, is there a way that I could sit there and ask for forgiveness in this aspect? It's hard, but you know what? Humility is a lot kinder than harsh words. It's amazing to me that we sit there and start seeing how that works. I have my AeroPress here, and an AeroPress is a great way to humbly just say, hey, I can do coffee. It's 2 little plastic pieces, pretty simple, nothing big. You take it, zero it out. You're going to take your coffee grounds, and you can take a good gander at that. Those are good looking beans right there. I'm going to sit there if we can. Whoop, we're upside down. These are good looking beans. You want them about that coarse. You want to pour them into your AeroPress. Now I'm doing an inverse AeroPress, because sometimes you realize that when you really want something to be done, you got to turn the camera on yourself. You have to look at some things and say, okay, how am I doing this? What's going on here? We're going to take our filters. And one of the ways that we do that with spiritual conflict is we use self-control. There's some things that probably don't need to be said, some things that do need to be said. And whenever we do this, we realize there's 3 things that need to happen. Is it kind? Is it truthful? And is it necessary? That's the question. We use these filters, and I use 2 of them really to extract the flavor and get the coffee out of it, and pour the wastewater in here. But self-control seems to be just like that. We use self-control due to the fact that it tempers us. Impulsiveness kills reconciliation. What we start looking at is this idea that if I say what I'm thinking right as what I'm doing, then sometimes it hurts. Sometimes those are the most hurtful things when you're being selfish and you pull something out. You say, what do I do? Well, is it kind, truthful, and necessary? You can say things that are truthful and necessary and say them in a very unkind way. You can say things that are not necessary. You can lie, but the reality is it doesn't do you any good. So what I've done here is I've poured my coffee, and I'm getting a little timer thing going here. And I want to stir vigorously for just 30 seconds or so to make that happen. Probably 15, 20 seconds. I've learned that self-control sometimes is the pain. The other side that we look at, the best chance I have to reconcile is if I'm being gentle with somebody. And I sit there and say, what does this look like to be gentle, to be honest? And I want to get up to 257 right there. I'm a little bit over, but you can see that. Right there. So being gentle with somebody. Now I'm going to let this sit for a couple minutes, and then we'll start pressing it and see what it tastes like. Again, we come back to the kind, truthful, necessary. I can say a lot of things, but if it's not out of kindness, out of gentleness, it's not going to do anything there. And what I've learned is I choose my words wisely. I had the best chance of reconciling. Now, if my words aren't backed up by my actions, it's kind of a pointless cause there. Kind, truthful, necessary. Maybe that's what you need. You also got to have integrity, because very rarely is there a conflict that you sit there and say, oh, this was all their fault. It's easy for us to cast blame on that, but the reality is we both have fault. We both see what this is. We both see the issues, but you have to sit there and own it. You have to sit there and say, hey, I might be upset, but I owned how I did this. The other day, I had to get on to Addison for something, and I blew up. I wasn't going to apologize for her getting in trouble, but the way that I acted, was my part, and I had to seek forgiveness on that. Conflict resolution is the thing we look there. One of the things that's probably the hardest thing for us to do is to ask and receive forgiveness and offer it. In Luke 17:4 it says, even if he wrongs you 7 times a day, turn your cheek and another 7. How many times should you forgive somebody? 70 times 7 times 7 is what Jesus says. And we start looking at this idea. Forgiveness is hard, because when we want to be forgived, we want other people to forgive us, and we want to sit there and say, oh, it's okay, and move on. Here's the thing about reconciliation. It's not your job to clean their side of the street. You have to offer freedom and walk away if they choose not to forgive. Sometimes reconciliation is best done when we say our piece and move on. There's a thing that happens with an AeroPress that's interesting. You have to turn it upside down to get the coffee out. The harder you press, the harder that it won't come out. Sometimes reconciliation, people need time, space, and even in churches, people need a time where they sit there and say, I don't know that I agree with this. That's okay. And again, we saw in Acts 15, it's all right not to agree with everybody all the time. It's just how you do it, even if you don't. What we found is forgiveness. I have to ask and offer it. But this reality is for reconciliation is, why am I going through this? How do I go to about a place that says, why does this happen? And maybe it's the question, and the simple answer is, what is God teaching me through this? Through this time, this season, you guys have been great. You've seen God move and do some different things. And we need to sit there and say, God, what are you teaching me through this? Maybe it's the time for you to reflect. Maybe it's time for you to offer an apology. Maybe it's time for you to sit there and say, I really want God to speak in my life. But I believe this, full-heartedly, as a cup of coffee. It's well-balanced and fruity. Does a lot of stuff for us. And as good as it can be, it can't be the best if I have one thing out of line. My spiritual life can't be the best if I have one thing out of line. So what do? Maybe you're here, you're seeking. You said, I want forgiveness for somebody. I want to offer some forgiveness. Maybe you need to. Maybe you also sit there and say, I don't really know what to do. Maybe you're stumbling. And you're a Christian, you believe it, but you're stumbling. And the reality is that you need to sit there and ask Christ to forgive you for what you're doing. That idea of stumbling could be a time for you that's holding you back. And maybe you're sold out. Maybe you understand the purpose of what reconciliation looks like. Reconciling with a parent, a sibling, a friend, and you understand the grace that comes with it. And so we go through these times. It's kind of hard. Church, the way it should be, should never be about a place that holds a grudge. It should be a place where all are welcome and where friends become family. But holding a grudge, it'll give you something to do, but it's not going to get you very far. Be blessed today. Take these and see what God's going to do. Allow God to speak into your life. And maybe there's somebody you need to reconcile with. Let me say a word of prayer. Father, thank you for my students and my friends. Thank you for the fact that we get to see you move in all kinds of things and give us clarity. Bless us in Jesus' name. Amen.